Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining today's session. We'll be talking to you today about the options to update and strengthen the Consumer Care Guidelines. The session today will cover a short presentation and some context setting by our policy team, and then will be followed by questions and answers. The questions will be done via the chat, and we'll be taking those and posing them to the team and trying to answer as many questions as possible. At the end of the session, we'll provide some contact details where you can reach the team and follow up with any other questions. Before we start, I'd like to introduce the team. We have Brent Lewis, our policy manager, and Steve Judge, our analyst today. I'd like to pass over to Brent to give you some context on this piece of work.
Thanks, Lisa. Just before I start, can I have a thumbs up from a couple of the people who've got their cameras on, just to indicate that they can hear us well? Excellent, thank you. I'm Brent Lewis. I manage the Retail and Networks Market Policy team here at the Electricity Authority. I'm just going to go through a bit of broader context stuff before Seb dives into the detail of the Consumer Care Guidelines themselves and the consultation that we've got out. First of all, thanks for taking the time to attend this session with us today. We really appreciate you making the time to do it. This is a bit of a different way for us for engaging. We're keen to get a bit of better reach and some more dialogue going on. So thanks for coming along. This session is specifically for you to provide you with information in your role as retailers for the context for this work. It might be that we've got other people along today. If you've joined today and you're not a retailer, then hopefully you can take as much as possible from this session and let us know if you have any specific questions if you try to that we'll be able to answer. But this is a retailer focused session. We have a relatively small team of people who work solely on consumer stuff at the authority, so it's a dedicated team, Seb and a few others. With consumers being at the heart of the work of the authority, we know that there's plenty to be done. Right now, our key focus is on the Consumer Care Guidelines Consultation, the publication that we've just issued. That's where we're putting our energy. We'd really like to get input from you as retailers on the cost of some of those proposals, the implications that they might have, how easy or difficult it would be for you to shift into some of these things. That would be enormously useful for us, and we're really keen to have detailed data in your submission, so real numbers and stuff, and we're really happy to maintain your commercial confidentiality on any of that sort of content. So if you have got anything like that, just let us know, and we will make sure that we respect that. There's some careful balancing that needs to be done in the work that we're doing here, and that's really between protecting the interests of the consumers and making sure that we continue to have a competitive and efficient retail sector. The need to balance these two things come from the authority's two objectives. So that's really at the core of what we're doing. That's means none of this stuff is straightforward or easy, none of it's binary, and we need to pitch the right balance, and it's important that you give us some good information and help us to get there. What our focus for now is on the Consumer Care Guidelines. That's not the only thing that the team is for, not the only thing that we will work on. Once we've got the guidelines work underway, the stuff which is contemplated in this consultation document, we'll be able to turn our attention to other issues, to wider issues. Along with the questions about making all or parts of the guidelines mandatory, we've included in this consultation a question about wider issues. So this is your chance to tell us about things you'd like us to focus on a little bit more out into the future. These could be new things you'd like to see in the guidelines, or changes to the guidelines, or other things outside the guidelines you'd like us to investigate or consider. I'll now hand over to Seb, and he'll talk you through the consultation in detail.
Thanks, Brent. So noting that quite a few of you, or potentially most of you, may have read the consultation paper, I'll try to keep this relatively short so we can go through to the questions and answers. So the context for the consultation, so we released the options to update and strengthen the Consumer Care Guidelines on the 4th of September for a 4-week consultation period, with submissions closing Monday, 2nd of October. This consultation is primarily focused on clarifying the existing guidelines and deciding whether these should be voluntary, or remain voluntary rather, or be made partly or fully mandatory. And as Brent mentioned, wider changes to the guidelines / other consumer care issues we are aiming to consider as part of an upcoming review and consultation process through an issues paper that we'd look to release by mid-2024. In terms of the problem definitions set out in the consultation paper, so it's the authority's view that the guidelines are not satisfactorily delivering their intended outcomes. So when we released the guidelines in 2021, the decision paper we released alongside stated that if it was found that the guidelines weren't satisfactorily delivering their intended outcomes, the authority would progress a work stream to look at making some or all of the guidelines mandatory. And that was based primarily on information we would gather through a review of retailer alignment as well as other mechanisms. So as you're aware, we released a alignment review earlier this year, which showed some variable alignment in retail's alignment with the guidelines through the self-assessments. And we've also heard from different consumer groups, as well as the Energy Expert Hardship Panel, that the guidelines aren't necessarily delivering their intended outcomes and performing as expected. And we have also heard from retailers through their statements and other mechanisms that there are some issues with how the guidelines are applied currently. A key point to make for this consultation is that options to do with monitoring are out of scope. So the authority is already looking to improve its retail market data collection, including information gaps relating to domestic consumer outcomes through a separate project, which you may have seen in some market briefs called the Retail Market Monitoring Project. So improvements for monitoring, including Part 10 of the guidelines, which has various things such as retailers providing information, including their alignment statements, consumer care policies. Options around changes to those have therefore been kept out of scope for this consultation, and we'll look to engage on those things a little bit later in the year. And I would note as well, for some retailers' knowledge, we are actively considering the data we currently collect under the Retail Financial Stress Notice, whether we can release that. Significant changes to content of the guidelines is also out of scope. So our view is that the guidelines continue to reflect industry consensus. As we said in 2021, it was quite a collaborative process that these guidelines were developed with engagement from retailers and a wide range of consumer stakeholder groups. Though there is a question in the consultation, if you don't think that the guidelines reflect industry consensus at this point, we'd encourage you to submit on that question. And as mentioned, wider issues that might fall outside of the guidelines will be considered as part of an upcoming review and consultation process. So moving on to the 4 options that we're considering. Option 1, status quo, do nothing. So essentially things would stay the same as they are now in our view. This is mainly included in the consultation paper as a comparison point for the other options. Option 2, the guidelines would remain voluntary, but with amended wording to clarify interpretation issues. So we have heard from some retailers through their alignment statements and other mechanisms that there are issues around potential different interpretations of wording in the guidelines, where the guidelines might say you have to take a reasonable action. What is that action? Where you can't disconnect people due to extreme weather events, what the threshold for that is, and also some other areas and issues around making sure to not disconnect people when they might be at risk of serious harm. Option 3 looks at codifying parts that we view as the most important protections for consumer welfare. So that's around Part 2, which is to do with retailers publishing a consumer care policy and making sure that in their communications with consumers, they make sure that the consumers know about this policy so consumers can be aware of their rights and retailers' obligations as well. And we know that there's very low awareness of the guidelines generally from surveys carried out by the Consumer Advocacy Council and other consumer representatives, that consumers don't have a good understanding of the consumer care guidelines or what they really mean for consumers. So mandating that part would look to increase that. The other parts under option 3 include part 6, so financial difficulty around recommendations for retailers when they interact with someone who has difficulty payment. So as you'll be aware, these is to do with referring to services, etc. Things supported by MSD, making sure consumers have information on energy efficiency, etc. And part 7, disconnection processes, so making sure retailers follow a disconnection process, making sure that customers get provided with notices for disconnection prior to actually getting disconnected. And part 8 regarding recommendations for MDCs, which is the main one there, making sure that medically dependent consumers are not disconnected for non-payment of electricity or through obtaining electricity through deception. I should mention as well that option 2 around clarifying interpretation issues would be done under option 3 and option 4. We wouldn't look to not address any of those interpretation issues through this process. And as part of codifying any of those parts under option 3, we'd look to make sure that they're appropriate for the code, noting that the guidelines can sometimes be quite open for interpretation at the moment. We'd look at making sure that the wording was appropriate for something in the code. Option 4 finally looks at codifying parts 1 to 9 of the guidelines with that same clarification through codification process. So including parts around making sure customers have proper processes when they're signing up a contract, things like information management and general account management, as well as making sure that fees and bonds are reasonable. The criteria for assessment we used was primarily based on these 4 bullets, but mostly the first 2 bullets. So the ability to deliver the intended outcomes of the guidelines. So quite usefully, the guidelines balance out consumer outcomes and also retail outcomes. So we do have intended outcomes around trying to make sure that disconnection is used as a last resort, as well as medically dependent consumers not being disconnected, as well as also having outcomes around ensuring retailers are paid for the services they provide and that innovation and competition is supported and the guidelines don't impose unreasonable costs on retailers. As well as that, with any area we would look to codify, as well as under option 3 and 4 of this consultation paper, the authority when making something into code, it has to be consistent with both our main and additional statutory objectives. So we've also included analysis in our criteria around how the options might align with the objectives. And then the final 2, which are weighted a bit lower than the first 2, are timeliness to complete, so how quickly we believe we can deliver each option, and also the cost of the authority, as we would expect some flow on costs from potential compliance or monitoring action. In the current consultation paper, based on our initial assessment, option 3 is preferred. So at present, we consider option 3 best delivers the key consumer protections that I outlined before in terms of a consumer care policy, recommendations to deal with financial difficulty, disconnection processes, and medically dependent consumers. And in our view, this option minimises the negative impacts on innovation, competition, and efficiency that could potentially be put on retailers and to the retail market. But we are, as Brent mentioned, asking for especially your feedback on this and the costs you might expect to take from any of these options and the expected impact on innovation, competition and efficiency in the retail market. And yeah, the consultation allows you to provide further evidence of the impacts of each option. So we really look forward to your views on that. The anticipated timeframes for this is, with the consultation paper closing early October, we expect to make a public announcement on a decision and a preferred option by early 2024. And at that point, depending on which option is preferred, we'd either go down one of 2 tracks. So option 2 would be keeping the guidelines voluntary, so we don't have the obligations under the legislation to do things like the CBA. So we'd probably move to a technical consultation and then make a decision on guidelines amendments by mid-2024, just clarifying those interpretation issues to make sure that retailers have a shared understanding of what is expected. If we were to progress down a mandated route of option 3 or 4, then as prescribed in the legislation, we would carry out a cost-benefit analysis and consult alongside the cost-benefit analysis on a draft code amendment. And we'd expect to do that in Q1 of 2024 or Q2 of 2024, depending on which option we pursue. Noting that option 4 might take a little bit more work on our part to draft the code and also figure out all the potential impacts in the cost-benefit analysis. Then finally, after we've done that consultation, pending submissions on that process, we would expect to make decisions on a potential code amendment by mid-2024 for option 3, or in the second half of 2024 for option 4, again reflecting the timeframes that we expect with the extra work potentially to fully mandate most of the guidelines. Just some information on submissions and engagement. So submissions can be made in writing through the usual channels by Monday, 2nd of October by 5 PM via the consultation email. And if you do have difficulties with making a written submission, you can email that email there and we'll consider what alternatives are possible. For this process, we're also running it a little bit differently to try and get more engagement from everyday consumers. So we're conducting a range of briefings and increasing our engagement with different consumer groups. as well as allowing some different channels for consumers to submit their views, such as a short form consultation that draws out the key questions that are relevant to consumers on our website, and also the option of a verbal submission. So if you would like to make a verbal submission, then you can also email us and we'd set up a time to discuss as well. And that provides a brief overview of the consultation. So we'll move on to any questions that you may have.
So please post your questions in the chat if you haven't already done so.
Or if there are no questions, we can all get some much needed time back. But
is anybody having difficulty with posting questions? Getting any questions? Why are the Consumer Care Guidelines, Christy Burrows would like to know, why are the Consumer Care Guidelines not part of the T's and C's?
Yep. So the authority does have voluntary principles for contracts. I believe minimum standards for domestic contracts and terms and conditions. So these are set slightly out of the guidelines. The guidelines do make some recommendations around things that should be included in a retailer's terms and conditions, but these are mainly to do with parts of the guidelines, such as making sure that fees are obvious and things like that. So at the moment, we're not looking at amending the voluntary principles for terms and conditions, but if that is something that you would like the authority to look at, then we would be happy to see that through your submission and consider as part of our options in early 2024.
It might be that retailers might want to think about whether their terms and conditions reflect the guidelines, particularly if we were to move to a model of making some parts of the guidelines mandatory, then I guess that might have some implications for how those terms and conditions work, because they would need to be consistent with the guidelines. Well, they need to be consistent with the guidelines ideally all the time, but if it was mandatory, then that becomes, some parts of the mandatory, then that would become a bit more focused, I think. Anything else?
Christy Burrows has a further question, or more comment, statement. She says, the problem is the amount of paperwork that customers have to do.
Acknowledge there's a balance between making sure that customers are aware of their rights, but also providing it in a format that's also palatable for customers and making sure that they actually do engage with it and read it. And I think that that is a difficult issue to bridge, and we'd be happy to look at that through your submissions as well.
I don't think we ever get to a model where customers are required to look at the entire consumer care if the consumer care guidelines were to become mandatory in full, just as an example, I don't think that then becomes something which customers are required to look at, but it is something that provides two forms of guidance, right? Firstly, so guidance in terms of how retailers set up their arrangements with customers, so they would need to align with those guidelines, and also as a reference source for customers to look at if they wanted to, if they had some concerns or some questions about whether their retailer was acting in the way that they ought to be. Anything else, Lisa?
No other questions at the moment. If anybody else would like to pose a question, please type it into the chat. Katie McHugh would like to know how will the monitoring expectations be consistently applied through the parts of the Consumer Care Guidelines if they were mandated?
So I think the monitoring is an aspect we're interested in looking to consult on a little bit later in the year. So I think the monitoring we're aiming to do later in the year does capture things that, well, we're consulting on things that would be captured under Part 10 around things that we want to know about consumer outcomes, and that wouldn't just be limited to parts, for example, that would be mandated under option 3, but it would look at potentially including things around the whole guidelines. So I think we're looking at consulting on that issue around monitoring later in the year. But yeah, we would expect there to be some kind of monitoring of both, I think.
Yep, that'll need to be the case if the guidelines are mandatory, or some parts of them are.
Yep.
Yes, we'll move something out there.
Next question is from Miranda Struthers. Will the authority be able to release the 2023 lessons latest alignment statements for retailers before the consultation on the Consumer Care Guidelines closes?
That's a good question, Miranda. I think under the current timetable, probably not. I don't think we'll quite manage to get that out. But it will likely be ready at the same time as we're considering submissions on the guidelines. So we will be able to take the information which is sitting out there now in a relatively raw form, so it's accessible to us. So we'll be able to take intelligence from what's going on there now when we're considering our position alongside considering the submissions. So sorry, I'll do that a bit more clearly. So after the consultation closes, we will consider the submissions and make recommendations to our board as to what the appropriate next steps are. At the same time as we're considering those submissions, we'll be able to consider the outcomes from the 22-23 alignment review.
The next question is from Pramiti Sami. Would like to know, does the authority have any plans on how to increase customer awareness of the guidelines as part of this work?
So I think currently we don't have any plans to do an education campaign, but we are trying to, I guess, raise awareness of the guidelines through these consultations by engaging with community groups and different consumer stakeholders to make sure that they use their communication channels to push out this consultation and get consumers' feedback. I think although that isn't a focused effort to necessarily raise education of the guidelines, we'd expect hopefully more people to be aware of the guidelines after this consultation, as well as the coverage it's getting.
It'll be interesting to see what submissions we get on that. I suppose one option would be that we could use that channel that we have now, which we already use, to make people aware of UDL and power switch, which is that statement on the bill. So we could potentially refer consumers to the Consumer Care Guidelines there. That's not something that's in our consultation now, and I don't know if we'd thought of it until just now, but if we see submissions on that, that's definitely something that we could think about.
Okay. Next question from Mitchell is, has there been in consideration of what penalties might be under either 3 or 4?
Sure, I can talk to that one briefly. So not yet, but if you've already understood the key point, which is that if we do move to making parts or all of the guidelines mandatory, then that failing to meet the guidelines then is a code breach, and code breaches are punishable by way of penalties. The authority has charged penalties to other participants for things that have been code breaches. So that is quite a real sanction. I think that would be something that we would need to consult on further before we were able to lock that into place.
Yeah, so I think the consultation paper sets out that we would be consulting on when we decide on which option to prefer. If it is going down the mandated route, then that would be something we'd consult on around how it might change our monitoring compliance strategy when we consult on the CBA alongside the proposed code amendment.
All right, your next question is coming from Quinton, and he said, will the authority be able to publish any financial stress or disconnection data before the Consumer Care Guidelines consultation closes?
Currently, I don't think we will be able to. It is under active consideration, but at the moment, I don't think we will be able to publish it by the 2nd of October, fortunately.
Greg McIntosh would like to know, would the authority be open to having a real two-way meeting with retailers to discuss our practical feedback? This one-way meeting format is fairly restrictive.
You want to go?
I think that's certainly something that we could think about. If people want to have specific dialogue with us, then let us know, and we'll work out what we can do about that.
Thank you. Going back to Chrissy, she had a further point to make about her particular question. Just want to find it. She was talking to us about the what consumers had to see, and she said fees are the guidelines on how these are structured. So I think she just wanted to make that extra point. If anybody has any other questions they'd like to ask, Brent or Seth or both. John, I'll get to that question now. Ben has a question. To assist distributors in complying, particularly if the Consumer Care Guidelines are codified, are there any plans to mandate EP4 as part of the work or in the future?
I think at the moment we haven't considered that, but we could look at what might need to be done to facilitate better communication between distributors and retailers under the guidelines being made mandatory if that is our preferred option. So we could look at those exchange protocols and what might need to happen there.
John Campbell would like to know, what considerations, if any, have been given to if or how consumer care can also be devolved to and resourced for by communities? While not arguing with the intent, we do have some concerns that a lot is being expected of retailers, particularly independent ones, and that this is not costless.
Yeah, I can start on that maybe, handle a few. Yeah, acknowledge that it's not costless, and I think in the consultation paper we do set out that these issues, although retailers and the authority do have a role to play, they are systemic issues mostly, well, sometimes, and a range of factors contribute to energy hardship that are outside of retailers and our control. And so I think we're trying to find a bit of a balance between making sure that when people do need help, retailers are a point of contact that they can go to be referred to a potential service, and that may start a pathway to resolving financial difficulty or other issues, but do acknowledge that it's a difficult balance to hit.
Yeah, it's well articulated, Seb. I think the key point here really is to think about what's the conduct of retailers. Are retailers working particularly with those vulnerable consumers or consumers that are struggling to pay in the best possible way? But we absolutely recognise that retailers, under the framework that we have now and anything that we contemplate in the near future, retailers are not necessarily going to ultimately be able to solve a situation where a particular whānau or whatever it might be has insufficient income to meet their needs. We have a wider social welfare system which is designed to deal with that, because if they're struggling to meet their electricity bill, they're also going to be struggling to pay their rent and struggling to put food on the table and those kinds of things. So it's really making sure that as the electricity sector, we're contributing to and helping the outcomes there in the best way that we can. But I don't think that we're in a model where we accept ultimate responsibility for some of those really difficult situations.
Quinton Caddis would like to know, how can we properly measure and comment on the effectiveness of the Consumer Care Guidelines if the disconnection statistics for the industry have not been shared since the current version of the Consumer Care Guidelines was implemented?
I can make a few points on that. So, I mean, we do release a snapshot of the data in the consultation paper at the moment, though noting that that is only for 1 month. Which doesn't address your question around releasing it for a further time period. I guess something that we do mention in the consultation paper is that disconnections in of themselves aren't necessarily a good indication of whether the guidelines are working or not. Coming back to Brent's point that there are a lot of wider factors that determine whether someone may be disconnected, and there might be different influences that aren't necessarily linked to a retailer. So I think we have to be careful about that.
Yeah, while disconnection is one of the things that the guidelines, I wouldn't say, I kind of seek to avoid. It's a last resort, but also seek to manage the conduct of retailers around. So that's the really important thing. And you know, we can all spin up a theoretical model that says that we have no disconnections at all, and the reason that we have no disconnections at all is because there's a whole there's a whole sector of the community that retailers are not going to serve anymore because those are the people identified at risk of not paying. So, driving all the way to zero disconnections isn't necessarily the right outcome either.
Chrissy, if the guidelines are set in code, would this be a new section of the code, or would it be incorporated as part into an existing part?
It's probably a drafting question that we haven't quite got to yet. I'm not sure that there's an obvious part that the guidelines would go into now, so they maybe they end up as a new appendix or a whole new part or something like that. Anything else?
We'll just get in one more round for any last questions. Last question from Greg. Is the authority aware of the potential unintended consequences that may happen if you mandate some of the guidelines? For example, retailers not offering services to some customers.
It's a really good point, Greg, and we've thought about that quite a lot. We want to make sure that the retail market remains competitive, that it's efficient, and that it's able to serve all customers. Those unintended consequences are really those consequences are really what would stop us from some kind of theoretical model where you'd say, oh, well, we're going to do something completely crazy like ban all disconnections or something like that, a little bit like that example I was given before. But retailers are much closer to the action here than we are. So this is exactly the kind of feedback that we want to hear in detail. The more evidence and more information you can give us about that, then the better. I think if I was just to circle back one step, what you've described is for us probably the difference between option 3 and option 4. Option 3 we're relatively comfortable with in terms of those broader consequences, although we're very keen to hear more information. Option 4 we're a bit less comfortable that that's going to be easily doable and would need a whole lot more investigation. So that's why our current dial kind of sits at option 3, but really keen to have a whole lot more feedback from you on that one. Really good question, thanks.
Unless there's any last questions, we can do a little bit of a wrap up. Brent, would you do the wrap up for us?
Thanks so much for attending and for listening and for all of the really good questions that we've had from different people on the chat. We really appreciate that. Please make your submission on the consultation if you're going to run through the usual channel, which I expect most of you will, by 5 p.m. On the 2nd of October. You can find all the details on our website under the consultation section, and I imagine that most of you have been there and found the consultation document already. If you have any questions or issues with making a written submission, please get in touch via our email. Seb, can you remind me what that was?
Consumer Care Consultation at ea.gov.nz.
Yeah, so that's Consumer Care Consultation at ea.gov.nz. And we'll, so if you've got any questions or concerns or further thoughts, please send them through to that email address and we'll see how we can help. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you all. Cheers.